It's no surprise that fierce and passionate battles around the world over the centuries have left strong imprints on the landscape. The name for this phenomenon is called stone tape theory, that speculates that ghosts and hauntings are analogous to tape recordings, and that mental impressions during emotional or traumatic events can be projected in the form of energy, recorded on the rocks, the surrounding landscape and the environments, and replayed under certain conditions. The following event could very well be a classic stone tape theory, where a ghost army was regularly witnessed by many people. Sutor Fell is in the English Lake District and stands to the south of Mungersdale village in the Northern Fells, and is famous for the appearance of a spectral army. The first possible witness to the ghost army took place in 1735, when a servant under the employment of William Lancaster of Blakehills. He was about a half mile from Sutor Fell and saw the east side of the mountain covered with regular marching army for over an hour. The ghost army appeared to come from the north end and marched over a niche in the top, but as there were no other witnesses to the strange event, he was discredited and laughed at. 2 years later, in 1737, on Midsummer Eve between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m, the servant's employer, William Lancaster himself, witnessed several gentlemen following their horses. Believing that the men were returning from a hunt, he initially chose to ignore them. Then about 10 minutes later, he again turned his head around, where the men appeared to be mounted alongside with a vast army. The army were in the same place where 2 years previously his servant had witnessed them, but was ridiculed and not believed. William Lancaster then called his family over, who also witnessed the strange event, and observed that one of the soldiers who quit the ranks seemed to stand in a fronting posture, as if he were regulating the order of their march and counting the numbers. After a while, he returned full gallop to the station he had left. The army then continued to march as long as there was light to see them. The next account of a ghostly army took place about 8 years later, where spectral soldiers were seen marching along on Midsummer's Day in 1745. On the evening of Midsummer's Day in that year, a line of marching troops, cavalry and carriages was seen travelling along the summit ridge of Sutor Fell. The ground over which they moved should have been too steep for such transport, but the procession continued to march for at least 2.5 hours until night fell, constantly appearing at one end of the ridge and disappearing at the other. It is claimed that the spectral army was witnessed by 26 people who'd viewed the proceedings and would later testify on oath to a magistrate of what they'd seen. The following day, some climbers walked up the Sutor Fell in search of evidence that the phantom army had really marched. But when they reached the soft ground of the ridge, found that there was no sign whatsoever that soldiers had been marching, as there were no footprints anywhere. So what were the eyewitnesses actually looking at? Because if it was only 1 or 2 people, it could easily have been dismissed, but the number of eyewitnesses was extremely high. Researchers then went in search of possible links with the folklore of the region. Sutor is a large mount in Cumbria, United Kingdom, and is situated about 40 miles from the Scottish border. 26 people had witnessed a series of horsemen marching across the top of the mount at a place which would normally have been impossible for cavalry to access. 2 years later, in 1747, a writer visited the area and spoke to several witnesses who alleged that the incident that had taken place in 1745 was not the only occasion the spectral army had been seen, as there had been other spectral sightings on the mountainside. Another eyewitness account was written by a man called James Clark, who grew up in the area and knew it well. In 1789, he wrote about the incident in a book called A Survey of the Lakes of Cumberland, Westmoreland and Lancashire. So what was the spectral army, and who were they? Over the years, there have been many Jacobite rebellions between 1688 and the last Jacobite rebellion in 1745, and each battle may have left a powerful imprint on the landscape, leading to any number of spectral armies. The following famous case of a residual haunting, or classic stone tape theory, took place after a major battle during the English Civil War. The Battle of Edgehill was the first major conflict of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651 and took place on the fields of Warwickshire between Warwick and Banbury in the West Midlands region of England. The Battle of Edgehill took place on the 23rd of October 1642 after constitutional disagreement between the government and King Charles I, where the king finally raised his standard and led his troops against the Parliamentary Army, who were also called Roundheads. Almost 30,000 soldiers clashed in a bloody battle where both armies suffered heavy losses during the 3 hours of fighting. Corpses which littered the fields were thrown into mass graves. However, this was not to be the last of the Battle of Edgehill, and shortly before Christmas 1642, and after the armies had left the battlefield, the villages continued to be haunted by spectres and apparitions. On Christmas Day, between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning, shepherds could hear the sound of drums in the distance, along with the screaming and yelling of soldiers and the cries of the dying. They could only stand in amazement as the sounds appeared to get closer and closer, when they quickly ran away, fearing for their lives. The shepherds had not gone far when a huge vision appeared to fill the sky with strange apparitions of two armies. They could hear the clattering of arms and the noise of cannon fire. They saw flags along with the sound of beating drums and musket fire, horses neighing, and the cries of the soldiers. They were now witnessing a full-on battle, and in the bloodshed in front of the shepherds, the king's forces seemed to have the advantage, but were later overcome by the parliamentarians, where the king's army was eventually routed. The shepherds were terrified. They could not believe what they were seeing, and were too scared to stay, but too afraid to run for fear of being caught up in the battle. They could only stay and witness the horrors that were taking place in front of them. The battle left a haunting that filled both earth and sky. The poor shepherds had to endure 3 long hours of watching the frightening scenes that would eventually vanish in the night sky. The apparition had lasted many hours and then disappeared by dawn. The shepherds then made their way to the village of Kinnerton, which was just over 8 kilometres away from the battlefield in Edgehill. On reaching the village, they went directly to the Justice of Peace, Mr. Wood, and his neighbour, Mr. Marshall, who was the local priest. They then gave an account of the whole battle and swore an oath that it was all true. Normally, any person that had come forward to the authorities claiming to have witnessed a spectral army and the ensuing battle would have been considered either mad or drunk, but many of the men were considered honest men with strong moral principles. Word soon spread, and the following night many villagers made their way to the Edgehill battleground, where they too were witness to the same horrific battle scene as the two armies fought each other in the same bloody battle. They were so terrified by what they had just witnessed that they quickly made their way home, asking God to defend them from the hell they had just witnessed. Then nothing happened for 5 nights, until the battle repeated on the following Saturday and Sunday nights with even greater ferocity. It repeated thereafter every weekend. News of the ghostly spectres eventually reached King Charles himself, who at the time was based in Oxford, approximately 48 kilometres away. King Charles then sent a royal commission of 6 officers to report on the sightings. The officers included Colonel Lewis Kirk, Captain Dudley, Captain Wayman, and 3 other gentlemen of high standing, who were sent to help calm the people of Kinnerton and to witness the apparitions for themselves. When the 6 officers visited the battlefield, the officers and a couple who had actually fought at the battle themselves confirmed the apparitions and even identified some of the soldiers. They saw Sir Edmund Verney, the king's standard-bearer. In a battle, the standard-bearer acted as an indicator of where the position of a military unit was. They had a bright, colourful flag that would act as a strong visual beacon to surrounding soldiers. When captured during the battle, Sir Edmund had refused to give up the standard. To take the standard from him, his hand was cut off. The Royalists subsequently recaptured the standard, where it was claimed that Sir Edmund's hand was still attached. After their ordeal, the 6 officers made a report titled A Great Wonder in Heaven, describing the late apparitions along with the noises of the war and battle seen at Edgehill. The report was published on 23rd of January 1643, and the Edgehill spectres are the only ghosts to be officially recognised by the British Public Record Office. The British Public Record Office was a guardian of the National Archives of Great Britain. Unfortunately, there were still many bodies that had not been placed into graves, and continued to litter the battlefield. The locals of nearby villages retrieved the bodies and gave them a Christian burial, in the hope that the soul would find peace. It is claimed that after the burials, the apparitions ceased. However, that was not to be, and since then, many people have reported hearing cannon fire, battle cries, and horses' hooves echoing over the Edgehill battlefield, especially around the anniversary of the event. Witnesses believe that it was caused by the restless spirits of the slain soldiers who were buried in a graveyard near the battlefield. Some modern-day visitors to the cemetery say that the place has a disturbed feel to it, and there appears to be no doubt that the horrific battle had left a strong residual impression in the surrounding environment, and appears to repeat itself over and over again for almost 400 years.